Hello, everybody. Welcome to MY's Day 2. I'm Cynthia Romero de la O, and you're sitting in the intelligence talk track. Some quick reminders. Lunch is today at 12:15 at the expo room, and it's first come, first serve. And if you want any special swag, make sure to complete the survey. And with that, I'd like to give a round of applause to our speakers, which are Ken Bagal and John Jensen.
Hi. So just to give a small preamble here. So 3.5 years ago, myself and John left what was this institution here. It was FireEye Mandiant at the time, in order to try and solve some problems for the security industry at large. So we were facing a plethora of kind of quickly made products that weren't really going into depth and trying to push security forward. So we undertook a large project to try and detect adversary infrastructure at a much earlier point than had been previously, by detecting their management techniques as they set up the infrastructure. So John's going to give you the full details of the project, but we've made a lot of the information available freely to the public via a community app. So if you go to silentpush.com, there's a free community app, and you can access all the underlying data for the project and a lot of the tools that we use to map adversary infrastructure completely for free, right? So make use of that, and I'll hand you over to John.
Thanks, Ken. Yeah, so the topic here is defense, really. That's the whole point of having threat intelligence. That's what it's there for. And we need to be better at using it to proactively defend ourselves against attacks that are relevant to us and that are upcoming. And so one of the things that we'd like to deal with is the fact that a lot of the threat intel feeds that we all know, they're all based on things that have already happened. So these might be domains and log files, or scraped out of a log file after some incident happened. And my clicker is not working, so if someone can help me to move to the next slide here, please. So the overview here, what we'd like to do is that we'd like to move to Threat Intel 2.0. And we're going to have to reinvent threat intelligence to make that happen. The difference between 1 and 2 in the versions here is that 2.0 is more proactive. And it's really the proactivity that matters from a defender's point of view. We want to be able to detect things as early as we can, and then prevent it from happening in our network. It's much more economical. It's very expensive to clean up from some attack that was successful. You have to trace things through your network, and you don't know if things are compromised or not. So the prevention is actually a very good investment that to do that. But we need better tools for this. So what we're going to be talking about is how we're going to end up with proactive intelligence. And there's a fundamental change in the way that we're dealing with data collection, the analysis that we're doing on top of that, and those kind of patterns that we can see. You can say, okay, then we can predict what's going to happen. It's not really that. It's not magic. These are just searches for known patterns that we can identify, and then we can search across all of the information space that we have access to. So here's some kind of just an overview of what the difference is between reactive and proactive defense. Right? Reactive is something that has already happened, and someone else is trying to defend themselves from something that's probably never going to hit them anyway, because if these are lists of domains that have been used in an attack against some other company, it is a very high chance that these were specifically set up for that particular purpose, and so it's very unlikely that the exact same domains are going to be used in an attack against you. But what we can do is we can look at those known events that have already happened, and then we can look at what patterns lie behind them. And then we can use those patterns, once we identify them, to search for other things that are related to the same attack or campaign or malware actor or any of those other threat actor groups that we might be interested in. And they all have different distinct characteristics. So the key thing here is that the threat actor has some defined processes that he uses to manage his infrastructure, because if there's domains involved, if there's servers involved, they have to be set up before he can carry out an attack. And so there's some preparation work that needs to be performed before he switches to attack mode. And these are all kind of things that he has. Maybe he has a playbook for how to set up specific infrastructure for something, how to manage his domains, where they're pointing to at what point in time, all of those kind of things. So these are really the threat actor TTPs, right? All of those things that work together. But from our point of view, we want to look at this from a defender's point of view. So once we've identified those, these are actually, the fingerprint. They make up the fingerprint of this particular threat actor or other group, cyber criminal, whoever it might be. So these are fingerprints that we can actually define as unique patterns. And so the effect here is that all of those things that the threat actor does to evade detection, these are actually evasion techniques that form a pattern. And so effectively we can search our information space for those evasion techniques that he's deploying. So from the defender's point of view, that gives us a whole new set of tooling that we can use. And it puts us in a very strong position to be able to actively defend against things before they actually cost a lot of money and effort to clean up. So I've listed some steps. They're not necessarily, they're not numbered because they're not necessarily happening in sequence. Like they can happen at more or less at random when something, you can become aware of something, and maybe you're reading an incident report or something like that. That finished intelligence has a list of things that you can extract some more information from. But the key thing is that we need some new attributes that we can attach to these standalone information bits. If it's just a list of domain without any context, it's really difficult to know how these are related and what else they might be related to. So the first thing we need to do is to actually attach additional information to those elements. And that gives us extended context. And the extended context is then one of the patterns that we can combine and search for in our search space. And that gives us a strong position to be able to find things that might be much more relevant to defend yourself against. So the way that could look is the extended contextual information. We attach that to each of those, let's call them IOCs, but there might be domains in a thread feed or something like that, right? So that's typically what happened. But we want to turn this into kind of a 3D representation. So we can call this composite objects, and that as opposed to just a list of domain names, for example. So the composite object contains all of the extended attributes, all of the extended context that it can be attached to this. And they really form then a search pattern. And this is actually kind of a three-dimensional search criteria that we can apply in our data. And these composite objects, they're all distinct for different types of behavior, different types of groups, or even smaller subsections of campaigns that are ongoing or coming up. So this is really useful, and I have a couple of different examples here because these, the representation changes based on what context that we're looking at. Right? But to be able to achieve that, we need to have some data that we can fit into all of those colored blobs in the 3D model, and that requires some work because we need to collect some data, but not only just for the for the sake of collecting it. We need to extract some actual insights from this raw data. And those insights, we can build attributes from those. And they mean different things, depending on what our view is. Things like time is very important in these kind of things because, first of all, Defender wants to be early in being able to detect things. But actually, an attribute could be a timing pattern as well. So there could be changes over time. There could be distinct sequences that we can identify as well. So a single attribute as well could be a 3D object that has a time dimension to it. And we'll see some examples on this later on as well. So here's the kind of the layered approach to doing it. Everything at the bottom is to do with data collection, different types of data that we collect. Like, it's not a complete and comprehensive view, but just to give you some idea of the range of different data elements that we can find. So obviously we can do some scanning on host names and IP addresses and all that. We can look at certificates and so on. The bottom left is PA DNS, that's actively collected DNS data as opposed to passively collected DNS data. That makes a big difference because passive DNS data is collected from what you call organic traffic, like traffic that happens naturally, right? So someone receives an email with a phishing link in it, so he clicks on the phishing link, that generates a DNS lookup request, and we can capture that, right? But now it's too late because now he's already clicked on the link, and that generated the traffic, so now we can't predict anything, right? So we need to know those things in advance. And the only way that we can do that is to not rely on all of that organic traffic. Right? Maybe it can supplement certain things, but it's fundamentally not the right way of doing it. So we need to be proactively collecting all this. So one of the big things that we're doing as a foundation data set is to actively resolve all of DNS every day completely. And so this is safe to say, this is a non-trivial task because there's lots of it. And also, we want to do it without making guesses. So we want to be able to actually trace factual information that exists and have a comprehensive view of names and what they resolved to and when they did, and any changes that occurred throughout the timeline. So this is a big part of data collection. Actually, having a new view of the foundation collection as a starting point. Right, and so from those data elements that we collect as DNS data, we can then decide to scan specific endpoints as well, because now we know what they're called. That means that gives us a better entry point to collect relevant certificates as well, because if you just scan an IP, you're not certain that you get a name-based certificate, so you can get whatever the IP tells you. But the name element is very important for the certificate collection as well. So the whole bottom layer is about collecting data, but not for the sake of collecting it, like with the view of organizing it in a way that we can extract actual insights from this. So the next layer up is some of the things that we do with the data once we have it. So change detection is a thing, right? And that's interesting. And at this level, kind of, we're just flagging the fact that something changed and maybe a timestamp, because the actual change pattern is on the level above, right? Because they can be viewed at in different ways. So that change detection is a thing. Density metrics. Density is fairly obvious, but it's an aggregation problem. So density can be attached to multiple different things. It could be attached to an IP address. If it's attached to an IP address, it means how many current A records are currently resolving to that IP address. That gives us the current density for the IP. If it's for a name server, it means how many domains are currently using this name server as a authoritative host for its zone. But we can apply that kind of principle to a lot of different things. Right? And diversity is the same. Diversity, we're starting to get into changes over time, but represented as a single object or a simple attribute. So diversity means what are the changes that happened. If it's to do with a host name, what IP addresses was it using, where they located in terms of IP space, AS numbers, and all of those kind of things. And then the timing dimension is included as well. Obviously, everybody is interested in reputation, right? So you can do reputation also, but again, the general principle is that we don't want magic. Like, we want everything to be explainable from the ground up. And so a big thing with reputation is that many of the reputation scores that you normally are used to working with, you kind of have to trust that they do what they say they do, but you don't really have a good way of interpreting them yourself. So when we're talking about reputation metrics here, we're talking about bringing data together and then applying some formula, and that produces a reputation score, right? But that's not that interesting in itself. Like, that's just a summary. So because we don't lose, the key thing here is that we don't lose the underlying data, and that's exposed together with the reputation. And that means that someone who's consuming that reputation in their own modeling or prioritization or response, they're able to see, at a glance, reputation. And if that has value, then they can use that for prioritization and so on. But all of the underlying data that is made up or that is used to make up the reputation is exposed as well. And so that means that you can, vary your interpretation on this, and it's pretty clear and easy to see how this reputation was created, and you can better understand what it might mean. Right? So, like, explainability is an important thing, and it's often, I think, overlooked in these kind of summarizations where, like, it's either some kind of reputation. It could be a machine learning model, or it could be some kind of AI system as well. Those are often very difficult to explain, right? So having this data exposed and available for, they could be additional attributes in modeling, for example. So when we move to the top layer, this is where kind of all of this value we can extract, in the middle layer becomes deployed, right? So the starting point is the enriched context. And we've saw that before. We have domain names, for example, or IP addresses. We can attach all of those additional attributes to those individual elements, and that gives us the extended context. So that's kind of a very important part of the composite object that we saw before. And these are all distinct and between different elements that you attach it to, but they share some commonality, or they could. Like this, so the interesting thing from a detection point of view is the overlap that we can actually identify there. And so based on that, we can do a number of different things, right? So we talked about building models, whether they're machine learning models or AI models or whatever they are. But the better the data that you have that goes into those models, the better those models perform, right? So that's why all of these additional attributes that we can build and explain and feed them into a model, that makes the model perform much better. And also you have a much higher chance of being able to explain the output from that process. So when we're talking about patterns, these could be change patterns, they could be other different types of patterns as well. So we can base that on the change detection that we did before, and now we can start to look at changes in a particular way. So typically that might be a simple sequence. So name server changes happen over time. When exactly did they happen? What type of name server was involved? Is it a self-named name server, or what's the density of the name server? Those kind of things. These are part of the change pattern that we can identify. Right? And so now the pattern becomes an attribute as well. And then we can start clustering all of this together. And this is really a big part of the TTP search. All of these different elements come together in different ways. And now we know something about this data element that we have. This data element might have come out of a thread feed, for example, but now we have the enriched context for this. And we can see we can really get a trace of the TTPs that were involved for this particular threat group to setting up the infrastructure that we're tracking. But the key thing is that that's only useful if for that particular instance. And then it stops there. So what you actually want to be able to do is you want to be able to search for this pattern across everything, because otherwise it's an interesting intellectual exercise to build these patterns for each individual ones. But if you can't search for anything that is similar, it's largely a waste of time. So the key thing here is that you want to be able to search for this everywhere. And this is the global search element that we have. And that goes back to the data collection layer, because the data collection has to be organized in such a way that you eventually will be able to search everything, not just for what you already know. And so I'll just give you, in the next part here, just some simple examples of the attributes that we can work with. So IP diversity is a good example where we kind of combine time and space in terms of changes, right? So we have an example here, let'sencrypt.com, or it could be let'sencrypt.org as well. The results are the same thing. That's on the left. And this is the IP diversity pattern for let'sencrypt.com over some time window, right? So I think it's 90 days in this one. On the right, we have another pattern that looks quite different. That's associated with a domain called let'sencrypt.at. But it's not at all the same pattern. Like the domain is similar. Like the number of IPs that are involved is similar as well. But the timing pattern is completely different. And so on the left, it looks like a normal kind of load balancing kind of scalable pattern. On the right, that's a run and hide pattern, right? Because the same IP is never used twice, and they're only active for a short period each time. Like there's a distinct difference in the kind of visual representation of these patterns. And so this attribute alone, incorporates the time, the timeline, the time aspect, the location that was involved, and the different AS numbers and so on. So if you're doing response to an alert that comes up in your SOC, for example, say, is this something I should investigate or not? This could be a useful hint as to whether it's worthwhile pursuing this further, whether it looks suspicious enough to spend a few minutes digging further into this or not. So this is a really powerful view to get that at a glance. And this is part of what's attached in the context. And this is just one of the many, let's say 70 different types of attributes of this nature that we can attach to every single element. So this is starting to be useful, right? So next we can start to look at name server changes and the density that was involved for each of the name servers. So if we're looking at name servers that have a low density, that means that there's very few domains hosted there. And so that's relatively uncommon because most domains are hosted on big shared services that host millions of domains. Some organizations might have a number of domains that they're hosting themselves on their own infrastructure as well. But those numbers tend to be in the medium range, right? So more than 100, definitely, right? So when we're talking about low density name servers, we're talking about something, 50 or less probably, right? But it depends on the situation, but very, very small numbers. And so that fact alone means that whatever else is hosted on that name server is probably related somehow as well. So density is a useful metric to decide whether to drill further into a name server pivot, for example. The pattern that we can see as well is interesting. If it's something to do with the self-named name server in a change pattern or chain that involves maybe Cloudflare or some other kind of, what is generally in play there is that Cloudflare is used as an obfuscation step because it just hides with all the other millions of domains that are hosted by Cloudflare. In some types of attacks and some types of exfiltration attacks that is done through DNS exfiltration, it might be required to have a name server under the attacker's control. And so very often then changing from Cloudflare to a self-named name server is an interesting event, right? And so that on its own could mean that that would something be worthwhile investigating. But when it's combined with all the other things that we can attach in the same context, then it becomes a really powerful, trigger for remediation or investigation. Things like domains that have expired and come back to life later on is interesting also, because often in certain types of attacks, the domains are registered and then thrown away after 10 minutes. They could be used to send a single email if it's an email targeted attack, and never be used again. And then they expire after 12 months and someone can pick them up. And so who picks them up after a year, for example? That could be interesting. What are they going to be used for? Are they going to be taken back into the same kind of hosting patterns that applied when they were first used? These are things that we can look for in these kinds of information streams as well. So SOA records is a common record. There has to be one for every domain zone in DNS. That's the start of authority record. And it contains a lot of interesting information. So what we do is that we search each of those individual information parts separately and in combination. Because each of the, basically it's a single string in the answer field, you can see it there. But it's space delimited, and each of the segments has a distinct meaning. We can use this in a number of different ways, because being able to search for those distinct data elements specifically means that we can combine different criteria within the same a single record. So things like email addresses are part of the SOA record. And this could be sometimes a viable substitute for WHOIS records, which tend to be obfuscated, and if they're not completely privacy protected, they could be anonymized in different ways. But sometimes the threat actors actually forget that the SOA record could contain some information. So there could be some information leakage from the threat actor in this kind of data. So we can look for that. Things like serial number patterns are interesting as well, because a lot of the malicious infrastructure is deployed using automation. And often that generates some patterns that we can trace. Right? Being able to search for self-referenced data elements is interesting as well, because that gives us a universal way of looking for your self-referencing names across the different parts of the data elements. And that way we just can search for that self-referencing fact instead of having to compose impossible regular expressions to try and handle each case individually. So this is a relatively powerful tool to have available, because, for example, the examples that we have is that we see the name server domain and the email address domain. That's field 1 and 2 in the answer line on the right. They actually contain the same domain, right? And same with the next record that we have. But the domains is different between the two records. As well, we can see that they share some other patterns, like serial number. Again, the type of name follows some distinct pattern that we might be able to extract a regular expression from, that we can use in other searches as well at some point. So there's a lot of, I think the SOA records are actually underutilized for this kind of investigation. There's a lot of information that is available in there. We mentioned the reputation scores and the fact that they have to be explainable in order to be usable. And so these are some examples of the types of name server reputation and the explanation that goes with them. So simple name server reputation based on density. That's a lot more relevant than just some random count. So in here we can see directly that we have this number of domains listed on the, or this server is hosting this particular number of domains, and then out of those domains we have 523 domains listed on thread feeds that we trust. So then we can apply some formula to that data. And the one that we're applying in this case is some logarithmic ratio. But having the data there means that you can do any formula that you want, or you can feed the data directly into some machine learning model that you have. On the right, we have our takedown reputation. And this is an extension of trying to evaluate how bad or how complicit the different networks are in hosting malicious content. So typically things like phishing links or things that point to malware downloads and stuff like that. These are links that we can easily find, and then we can report them to the network where they're hosted, and then we can wait for them to be taken down. And sometimes that happens quick, in a few minutes or hours. Sometimes it takes a very long time. And if that's a recurring pattern, then you could start to suspect that the network operator doesn't care, or he's complicit in the original malware operation or phishing activity that was involved. So again, we can break down all of these numbers, and so what we do is we measure the lifetime, how long these URLs survive inside of each of the network spaces that they might point to. And then the rest is just a simple summarization, right? So we have things like lifetime metrics and how many are there. URLs in individual numbers as opposed to IPs, because one IP could host multiple URLs. But each of those have some distinct meaning, and it's valuable to be able to track that. So this is the general principle with reputation scores. This is how it works. Like, the formula is not always the same that's applied to the data, but everything is there and available to see directly. So we want to, like, the black box thing doesn't work for us, right? It doesn't work for you, and so it doesn't work for anyone, right? So we want to avoid all of that, and this is part of the ways that we're trying to do that. So in the next part, I have a few minutes left, so I'm going to quickly go through some case studies of things that we can actually find using these attributes and these techniques. So the first one is pretty simple. So we start with a phishing domain, and then, like, one of the first steps that you might like to do is to see where is this kind of domain hosted, like what name servers is it using. So we can do a forward lookup on that, and then that tells us the name server. The next thing that we can do is we can try and see, like, is it worthwhile digging into this name server and see what else is there? Because if there's millions of domains, they're probably not really related. So density is a good starting point. Like, you want to have a look at what's the density of the name server that you found. So in this case, it's 38. So this is pretty low. So there's a high chance that whatever is hosted on that name server is related somehow. It could be related to the same campaign, not necessarily, because there's things like malicious infrastructure as a service as well, and they could be providing name server infrastructure for these domains, but they're definitely related somehow. And so it's not a waste of time to actually look at what else is hosted there in terms of what domains are using the same name server. So in this case, this is just a case of doing a simple reverse name server lookup. Again, this is something that you can do in passive DNS, no problem. Everybody does that every day, all day. But it doesn't necessarily give you the complete view. So we're doing this against actively collected DNS data. And that's where the difference is, because that means that even if somebody has not seen these domains before in organic traffic, or no name resolution event has happened naturally, we're still able to find it because we're doing all this data collection proactively. So this is kind of what makes a big difference in the scope of visibility that we can create for these kinds of data events. So the next example here, again, very simple example. We find a C2 server and a domain, and we figure out, we can go and collect the SSL certificates there. And then, because we're now also doing data collection from all the named endpoints that we can find across the internet, we now have a very large collection of SSL certificates. So now all we need to do is to actually look for the fingerprint of this certificate that we found associated with the C2 server. And then in a lot of cases, this one in particular, there's a good chance that that certificate is actually reused across the malicious infrastructure. And so what we find then is that when we pivot on that, we can identify all the other domains and IPs where this certificate is used, and all of those servers then are C2 servers related to this malware. But again, simple if you have the data. The next one, start to combine a few of these different techniques, right? So we have Raccoon Stealer. It works basically around a fake software catalog. Everybody wants stuff for free, and I'm going to pick up some free stuff here in the hall later on. But when it comes to software, that's really dangerous because things that you'd normally have to pay for, if you can give that, or if you can get that for free, like that's usually be suspicious straight away because there's a reason for that, and this probably is infected by some malware. There's a very high chance that that's the case, and so this here is basically a catalog of free software, but it's all infested with Raccoon Stealer and other things as well. But we can start with the catalog page, right? And so we can get the DNS information from the domain that is used to host that catalog. And then we can see the name servers, we can see the IP addresses for where the A records are hosted, and what the AS numbers are. That's a good start. So that this kind of forms the basis of something that we can see at a glance. There's a little bit of a pattern already emerging because we have a name server change in there, and we have some distinct IPs across multiple AS numbers where this is hosted. So if we go to the next step, now we can do a global search for things that have A records in any of these two AS numbers, and at the same time had the same type of name server change sequence that we saw for the originating domain. And those kind of 3 or 4 distinct elements, that's enough to actually find the rest of the domains that are associated with this particular Raccoon Stealer campaign or setup. And that's the list that we get down there below. So this is starting to be really useful, that we can combine those different things that contain changes and locations and things all in one. So I just put in an example of those ASOA records that we talked about before, because here's an example for how we might find some other C2s that are managed in a particular way. And they, like the domains for this, generates SOA records that follow some distinct format. So with that as a starting point, we can go in and identify that pattern. And so in this case, we have 8 or 9 different distinct elements that form the pattern that we can now apply to all of the SOA records that we have. And so one of them is a name server, or is a name server name. Another one is the regular expression that gives us a kind of the structure of the domain names that are hosted there. We have the mbox name as well. It's a fairly generic one, but in association with all the other things, it makes sense. The serial number is interesting as well because in a lot of cases, serial numbers in SOA records default to some timestamp-based representation. And actually, what that means from our point of view as a defender is that we can apply time fencing to the serial number. And that gives us time windows for when something might have happened. So this is a really useful thing to be able to use. And so an example of some of the results that come up as records matching those search criteria. So I have the next one here is looking at different conditions. They're still a kind of simple DNS types searches, but we're just looking at multiple different elements at the same time. So these are fake trading apps that are hosted on a particular content delivery network. And the observation here is that the domain names follow, or host names rather in this case, they follow some distinct pattern because they're C names mapping to the content delivery network. So once we have that pattern, we can then go in and do simple multi-condition search in our data. So in this case, the data is relatively tabular, so we can search across multiple columns at the same time. And when we do that, just with that simple patterns, we find all of those other trading apps that are all related to the same campaign or operation that is running them. And many of these have not been used yet, right? So you'd be able to see, for example, if you do an intersection analysis with thread feeds where these that are tracking specifically, malicious trading apps or fake trading apps in this case, most of these domains are not actually on those lists. So this, from a defender's point of view, this gives us, a strong advantage that we can start taking action against this. So the last one, finally, is the Raspberry Robin worm. This is an example of IoT, networks used as C2 servers. So obviously those IoT devices are compromised, and there's some malware using them as C2 servers for their botnet. So again, we can track this by DNS data and network-related elements. We don't need to dig down to traffic flows or on the packet level. We can do all of this, or a lot of this, with the things that we can collect openly available. So what we can observe here is that the domains that are used for these to identify these C2 servers follow some distinct naming patterns. They're also using some distinct TLDs. The other thing that we can notice is that they change very fast. So the resolution of the names change IPs very frequently. And also, they're not close together, so they're in multiple different AS numbers. So one of the things that we can do as a starting point is that we can attach all of this extended context to one of the ones that we know is a C2 server infected in this kind of way. So this gives us information about the IP diversity and AS diversity, as well as some name server information. So the next thing then is that we can use that as a starting point for our search. So one of the ways that we can get started with this is that we can use the name server that is there. We already figured out the regular expression to find the name, so we can use that as well. And then we look for IP diversity constraints. And so we're not looking for specific IPs, we're not looking for specific AS numbers, we're just looking for some names that have changed resolution across at least 5 different AS numbers over some distinct period. And so this is a radical difference from having to search only for things that you already know. Like these, now we're searching for things that we don't know, but we know what the pattern is. So this is that's what we are doing here. And so that gives us a lot of the other C2 servers that are available. And so when we summarize that, so this is one of the examples, because now we have the IP addresses, now we can do reverse A lookups and see what names are resolving there, because normally there shouldn't be anything resolving to those IP addresses because they're C2 servers and they're IoT devices, they're not web servers, right? So we can combine all these different techniques. So when we do that in the end, we come up with 623 unique and distinct IPs for this infrastructure, and as well as hundreds of domains that we haven't known about before. So this is a really good kind of example of being able to pivot through this. And in the original report, it mentioned that there was a specific type of or brand of NAS device that was compromised in this way. And that's true, but we find other examples as well, because now that we know where they are, we can go in and see what type of devices are they, and we can summarize in that. So we find a whole new element to this infrastructure that's hosted around the globe in South Korea, Germany, Hong Kong, and several other places as well. And not just that distinct device type, others as well. So that could mean that they share some common vulnerability, or there could be other things as well that could be worth looking into from a malware point of view. But from the defender's point of view, we just need to know where they are so that we can defend ourselves against them. So finally, this is the summary, right? So this is the final slide of this. what we want to do, we want to be able to turn the attacker's evasion techniques against them. Because when he has a fixed way of managing his infrastructure, if we can identify exactly what that is and we can block it, that means that the attacker has to change all of his methods of managing his infrastructure, because now we know what they are. So this is very expensive in terms of effort. There could be actual monetary cost associated with it for him as well. But it slows him down, and it imposes some difficulty on the adversary's part. So this is really the goal that we want to do, that we want to achieve, and this is one of the ways that we can do that. So I'm out of time. Thank you very much.